evening, everyone. I'm Doug Billiard.
And I'm Laura Von Lowe. Our top story, running out of time.
An execution date is now on the books for convicted local killer Odell Barnes. That date, March 1st, 2000.
My name is Mike Charlton, and I'm one of 3 lawyers who represents Odell Barnes. Odell was convicted in Wichita Falls, Texas, for capital murder of a woman named Helen Bass. He'd known Helen Bass for a number of years. Helen was one of his mother's best friends. They both worked together at the Wichita Falls State Hospital and knew each other for many, many years. It's a small community, and they had become close. Over the years, Helen Bass had allowed Odell to come into her home a number of times. He worked on her home. He did a lot of repair work on her house. He was allowed to have parties in the barn that she had out there at her house, and they were good friends. Odell was released from the penitentiary for an offense, and when he got back to Wichita Falls, he probably became addicted to crack cocaine, and he committed a number of pretty violent crimes. The reason why all this conduct of Odell's becomes relevant is that's the reason why they arrested him.
Odell was an easy target. Odell was a person that they could blame this on and get away with it without doing a lot of extra work.
These individuals will engage in criminal conduct that is similar to an offense for which they're convicted or for which they're charged, and the police normally just operate in patterns. They find somebody who's a suspect in a similar case, and they think that if he's committing a similar crime, he's obviously good for the crime that they're investigating. They arrest him for that, and they leave it to the court system to sort all that out later. They focus on patterns.
There's a lot of things which really suggest that the investigation in this case was far from professional.
We have seen in the police police property room, a footprint that they claim belongs to Odell, but nobody can tell us where that print came from. And it's not something that was found in Mrs. Bass's home because it's a footprint on an official court document, which is, it doesn't make any sense why that would be in her home. What we think is what happened is that when Odell was arrested and taken to the Wichita County Jail, that a piece of paper was set on the floor, and he was told to step on that paper in order to make a footprint impression.
The investigation itself, the preservation of evidence itself questions this verdict.
You look at the photographs of the crime scene and you see blood virtually everywhere. It's a very, very violent crime. The victim died of not only just a blow to the head, but a pistol shot and stab wounds. Okay, it's an extremely horrific crime with a great deal of violence in the room where she died. Most of that evidence was never subjected to any kind of forensic analysis or any kind of police investigatory methods that we commonly associate with homicide.
There was a big deal made early on about a piece of cloth found on the fence in the backyard. However, later on it doesn't fit because it was blue cloth, and they're trying to show that Odell was wearing green coveralls. It just doesn't fit.
If you take a look at the blood spatter that's all over the room, you form the conclusion that there was more than one participant in this crime, in this murder. You start seeing all this stuff that was never subjected to fingerprint analysis, any kind of bloodstain work. None of this typical forensic technique was ever applied to Odell's case.
There's evidence I've observed that's been taken that I don't know where it's from. There's cigarette butts lying on the floor which have never been tested that I could determine for DNA or just bodily fluid testing, saliva testing.
There is evidence that we will find on an evidence log that they cannot show to us. We have no idea where it is at this time.
The police have commented about Odell's case in Wichita Falls that they use Odell Barnes' case in order to train police officers how not to conduct a crime scene investigation. Robert Brooks, for example, who saw Odell jump the fence, saw Odell jump the fence 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes before Helen Bass ever got off work. He saw Odell jump that fence at 10:30 at night. Mrs. Bass got off work and got home at 11:45.
Another thing that's important to look at there is Robert Brooks never told anybody there was someone in the car with him. However, we have a written statement signed by Bobby Jean Brooks, who was his sister, that swears that she was in the car at the time, and at the time that this occurred, that someone jumped that fence, Robert Brooks was not very sure that it was Odell Barnes. Pat Williams, according to our investigation, was a drug dealer in Wichita Falls. In this case, he becomes important because he testified in Mr. Barnes' trial regarding purchasing the gun from Johnny Ray Humphreys and Odell Barnes. Pat Williams, 1 month before this trial, entered a plea of guilty to 2 criminal charges. One was delivery of a controlled substance, which was a first-degree felony at the time. The other was possession of a controlled substance.
At the time when Mr. Williams was arrested, right before Ms. Bass was killed, the district attorney of Wichita County had a policy against plea bargaining on drug cases. That Mr. Williams, however, got a plea bargain on 2 separate drug cases, one of possession drug case, the other actual hand-to-hand delivery drug case. And in both cases, that plea bargain called for him to receive a probated sentence. The court documents are very clear on that. That following being placed on probation, his probation officer constantly suspected him of engaging in criminal activity. You read his probation file, and there's just page after page after page of him making trips to Dallas, and the probation officer calling the police department and saying, I think he's dealing drugs, I think he's going to Dallas to make a run. She's constantly going to the district attorney to try to get that probation revoked or at least severely modified so that his movements are restricted, and constantly she's being rebuffed by the district attorney of Wichita County.
Our information was, at that time in 1989, that the district attorney's office did not make plea bargain offers in drug-related cases. Only days before Odell Barnes went to trial, Pat Williams was offered and accepted a probation on a drug case. He did less than half of the sentence before he was released early.
You know, his treatment by the district attorney's office is certainly something that suggests strongly that a deal was made and that he was being protected by the district attorney's office of Wichita County.
We also have a statement from Pat Williams' old girlfriend that suggests the same thing, that he was making a deal with the police department, and that the police department, what they wanted was they wanted Pat Williams to put the gun in Odell's hands. And Tammy Lewis gave us a statement to that effect.
Rodney Brown is another example of a witness who was interviewed well after the trial and who saw Patrick Williams with a bloody pistol on the night Ms. Bass was killed. When he confronted Mr. Williams about this, Mr. Williams told him, essentially that his story was that he knew nothing. It's just part of another series of circumstances that points the evidence away from Odell Barnes and to someone else who's responsible for Mrs. Bass's murder.
Johnny Ray Humphreys, we've suspected, was involved in this murder for a long time. Apparently, at least in his presence, one of his sisters accused him of committing this murder, and he did not deny it.
We have evidence that an eyewitness saw Johnny Ray Humphreys coming out of Mrs. Bass's house the time the murder was supposed to have occurred, and not Odell Barnes.
Johnny Ray Humphreys was acting extremely nervous that evening. He was saying he had done some things wrong. He just wouldn't expound on what those things were. And Marquita Mackey herself told the police that it looked like he had blood on him.
Marquita Mackey was an inmate at the Wichita County Jail. At one point, Odell was brought back for sentencing, and it was on television. And she made a comment to another woman in the jail at the time that Patrick Williams and Johnny Humphreys along with a third person, came over to her apartment one night, and Humphreys admitted killing Ms. Bass. And that basically, if Marquita were supposed to keep her mouth shut, and if she didn't keep her mouth shut, she was likely ended up just like Ms. Bass. That dovetails with other circumstances that we have found, which we think support the theory that someone else killed Ms. Bass.
Our evidence suggests the very people the state used to convict Odell Barnes actually committed this crime, being Johnny Ray Humphreys and or Pat Williams.
One of the items of evidence that was used to convict Odell was the presence of 2 small dots of blood on his coveralls. Now, this is 2 very small dots of blood in a room where virtually everything else is covered with blood, the victim's blood.
The coveralls and the blood stains that were found on the coveralls, there's several problems with that. First off is just the crime scene. Based upon my experience of looking at crime scene photos for years, I question that immediately, because it's just flat impossible for someone to have been inside a room in which a victim was killed by stabbing, by blunt force trauma, and by shooting, and in that same room there being blood spatter evidence on at least 3 walls, the ceiling, and the floor, and to walk out of there with only 2 small, tiny, minuscule blood stains. That's a question to start with.
The so-called blood stains that were found on Odell's clothing, we've now determined were in effect planted blood stains. They've been subjected to testing, and we find abnormally high concentrations of citric acid preservative in those blood stains.
What we found of significance was that one of the stains had a tremendous level of citric acid present in it, 40 times higher than what we would normally find in a human being. And this was consistent with that stain having originated out of a test tube, a yellow-topped blood collection vial, as opposed to having come straight from a human being onto the garment, the coveralls.
There is no way that this citrus acid or this chemical could have occurred naturally. There's no way it got on these coveralls naturally. There's no way it got mixed with the blood naturally. It would not occur in the natural events of life.
It's the same kind of preservative that if you go down to a hospital and you have your blood withdrawn into a test tube, it's the same kind of preservative that coats that test tube. And it indicates in the manner, the words of that particular chemist is, it's the worst case of planted evidence he's ever seen.
I have seen other cases where there is evidence that blood evidence is tainted, but the findings have been comparatively subtle. Here, it's very clear, very, very obvious that this particular stain is not natural, it's tainted evidence.
There was a fingerprint, for example, that was found on the lamp that they believe was used, one of the murder weapons, to kill Mrs. Bass. And that fingerprint does belong to Odell Barnes. They put a friend of Mrs. Bass, they being the state prosecution, put a friend of hers on the stand who testified that she had just purchased that lamp within a 2-week period before her death, and left the implication to the jury that that fingerprint had to be placed on the lamp at the time that she was killed. But her son, Mrs. Bass's son, signed an affidavit for her saying no, that she had owned that lamp for many, many years.
We have other written statements which show that Odell Barnes was fixing the victim's roof, that he was having the consensual sexual relationship, and that he had been over there helping move furniture, all of which would have given him an opportunity to have left a fingerprint in this home.
There's a chemical test that can be run on semen to determine the age of the deposit. And it is the absence of that chemical known as P30 that shows that the semen found in Mrs. Bass had been there at least 48 hours, 2 days before her death, verifying and corroborating Odell's story that this was a consensual sexual relationship.
Along those lines, we have several statements that Odell Barnes and Miss Bass had a consensual sexual relationship. They were family friends. He was often in the house, and it was a consensual relationship. And surely Dr. Johnson's statements support these allegations.
It's my understanding that the state contends that Odell Barnes raped Helen Bass at a time very close to her death. And our findings on the vaginal swab are that there is undetectable levels of seminal fluid and very, very few spermatozoa present, and that is not consistent with ejaculation into the vaginal vault at a time close to her death. And So those findings are inconsistent with what the state contends as if that was presented to me.
This kind of circumstantial evidence that was brought against him at trial has been explained and has been rebutted by investigation that was never done in Odell's trial, that was never done in his state habeas corpus proceeding, and in fact was never done until 2 years ago when Phil Wishcamper, Gary Taylor, and I got involved in this case as lawyers, and then a number of people got involved in this case as investigators.
Throughout our work on this case, we have continued to find evidence which suggests Mr. Barnes is innocent.
We have shown these photographs, we have shown the videotape that was taken of the murder scene, and shown that to other homicide officers who have informally told us that it suggests a much different modus operandi for this crime than Ms. Bass being victimized by Odell Barnes. It suggests that, in fact, that she was being made an example of, that her death was very slow and very painful, and at the hands of more than one individual, probably 3 people.
When we were before the U.S. District Court, I sought the appointment. I asked them to give us the resources to have a fingerprint expert. I asked for a crime scene analyst. I asked for a DNA specialist, and I was denied in each one of those situations.
Compared to all of the other cases that I've ever seen, read about, researched, or worked, this is deplorable. And it was not even a reasonable effort at an investigation.
In my opinion, this execution should certainly be stopped. I think the court should stop this execution and take a look and find out what in the heck is really going on with this case. I think it would be a gross injustice to carry out this execution in the face of these findings that the evidence, at least some of it, is clearly not legitimate.
Based upon everything we have found, we believe that he is innocent of the offense for which he was convicted.